Wadley served and worked with the horse. He was called Staff Sergeant Reckless. A horseman himself, Sergeant Wadley has spoken at various events across the nation about this special horse. So please join me in welcoming Sergeant Harold Wadley.
Well, it's my privilege to honor a little mare. A lot of you are horse people or have horses or wish you had some, and others wish they didn't have, but they're very special. And this little mare, the Korean War started on the 25th of June 1950, and North Korean part, the Chinese weren't into it yet, but they still had some Mongolian troops with them. And I can tell you, the Mongolian troops do not surrender. It's not in their vocabulary. But the mare was at a racetrack. The Japanese had ruled Korea for about the last 20 years, and they were great horse people. They had a big track there south of Seoul, and they had stables, and Lieutenant Pedersen of the Recoilless Rifle Team, 5th Marines. I was not in the actual rifle unit. I was in the assault section, and the 75s, of course, fired ahead of us most of the time, and in support of our actions. And they needed somebody to help carry that 115-pound gun unit, and particularly the ammo. Each round of a 75 is about 22 pounds. And it'd take a lot of Marines to keep humping that up to different hills. So Lieutenant Pedersen took his $250 and he surveyed the stalls around the track, and they came up on this little mare that just fit that. In her name in Korean was Achimhai, which means morning flame. And so the guys didn't know what to name her when they hauled her in, and they taught her how. Some of the pictures here show how these dipsticks taught a horse to load in an ammo wagon, and you can tell most of them didn't know which way they were going, but the little mare was smarter, and she decided, I better hop in that thing. And that was her trailer, and they got her back up to the outfit and asked, well, what will we name her? And the radio call sign for their unit was Reckless. And the guys, being a bunch of brilliant Marines, they said, well, we'll just use Reckless for her name. And so that stuck. And she was, a horse needs leadership. They're a herd animal, and really Marines and soldiers are kind of herd animals as well. They need leadership and something to care for. And so she just made that part of her life, living in the tent when they were offline, and she ate in the mess hall. Some of her favorite foods were Coca-Cola, cake, candy, except what we call the John Wayne cookies in the C ration. These guys that ate 45 C rations from World War II, we still were eating them in Korea. And you'd break your teeth if you tried, so that Reckless loved them. And she also took up with Gunny Latham, Joe Latham, who was a Georgia boy that helped train her and to lay down at the sign of incoming, the sound of mortars coming in, and she was taught to bend and go under the barbed wire. And at the first sign of incoming, she heard it before anybody else did. And so the guys got to watching Reckless and to see how she's reacting. And the only thing she didn't like on the phony eggs, the powdered eggs, was pepper, but she liked salt on it, so the guys were always eager to sort the food for her. And in the wintertime, they moved over in the tents that had, our salt outfit didn't have all of that high living as the guys in the rockets, but they would move over, put a sleeping bag down, and she would stand by. They had an old stove in it, and so she was the pampered one, but she knew where her gun teams, there were 3 guns that would be positioned, and then lead her out to that after she was loaded, generally with 6 to 8 rounds, and each round 22 pounds, and she wasn't but hardly 13 hands and a finger taller, maybe 700 pounds, but tougher and all get out. And she made that trip back and forth to her gun teams after getting loaded. And then it was on then in March 26th, and it quit the cold stuff, but we had rain and trying to snow. And I was on the lookout called Vegas. There were 3 of them, called them Nevada cities, Carson, Reno, and Nevada, because it was figured a gamble to stay on them. Vegas was 1,300 yards out in front of the main line. Reno was out 17, and Carson was out about 800 yards, one of the closest ones. And of course, surrounded by that's when the division had pulled back from the assault forward movement, and the 38th parallel judged everything. So the 38th parallel, we could take any hill past that, but we couldn't keep it. And the Chinese knew that on different raids. I managed to make it through 3 raids, and that's about the limit. I was with the 5th Marine outfit, and the amount of fire that started on the 26th of March, Lieutenant Taft, Kenneth Taft, was our platoon leader on the outpost. There were 47 Marines on it. The relief squad came out right after dark, and they forgot to bring the map case that Taft wanted. And since I was Jerry Point on the patrol, was due to my mines and booby trap training and that, and we canceled paroles for some reason. And I said, well, I'll go back and get that pack. And so I took off back for the main line, and all the way down through it is after dark, of course, and I could hear coughing on each side of the trail, and he had already told me that there's no Marine patrols out, because you do not want to run into a Marine patrol in the dark. And so I thought, gosh, that can't be. And so then I could smell garlic, and I thought, okay. And in the kind of drizzling rain, I thought, well, they're letting me pass, and I don't want to act like I know that they're there. And so I got on in through our wire to a hotel, well, his hotel company, then the command post, the CP, and told the first sergeant that I said, gosh, there's got to be, well, I won't use our word, but enemy on both sides of that trail. And he said, well, we don't have any listening posts reported yet. And I said, gosh, they may be dead. But we generally put out a Marine. We didn't have all the radios you have now, but he had time to get back in to the CP. And I said, well, he isn't back. He's laying low, and they're passing him. And so anyway, about that time, it's about 7, I think the records say 7 p.m. and dark, and Vegas lit up like a Christmas tree, and I thought, my Glenn. And so I started on up, and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Oddie grabbed me. I'd been on a couple of raids with him, a super duper guy. he fought on Guadalcanal and Saipan. And he says, you aren't going back. He says, you get down to the Korean Service Corps camp and get chiggy bears, those that carry supplies for us in stretchers. Says, you're going to retrieve our dead and wounded. And I thought, okay. And I've had bad assignments, but I tell you that detail was about the worst ever for it, because you're alone, you aren't with a bunch of Marines. And a lot of these South Korean workers had no part for walking into all that mortar. There was something like, I think 500 rounds. The station that picks up the radar, reverse station, letting you know how to track the ammo incoming. And there were something like 800 rounds a minute coming in, and of which amounted to about 5 every second. And the whole air was just concussion after concussion. And then I looked up, and on the east side of Vegas was a buddy of mine, Woody Woodrow, a kid from Mississippi. He was on an A4 machine gun, Light 30 gun, and he had just come off a USS Repose from wounds, and he could have gone home. But he said, no, we're all short. We were never full strength or half strength. And so when I saw hit the fire from his gun, the tracers going vertical, I thought, oh man, somebody else has got a hold of his gun, which they just run right over a gun, yank it right out of the tripods and sandbags. And there were 3,500 by Chinese counts that hit Vegas that evening, and there were only 47 of our guys there. One of them a good corpsman buddy, Doc Penn, Billy Rivers Penn. And if you go on the magic computer and type in agony and redemption, story of a POW, that's Doc Penn. About the time that they were loading the pack saddles on Reckless, the timing, I'll relate back and forth between Reckless and what we were trying to do. And at that time, the pack saddles and stuff, Reckless had broken into a sweat. And those of you that know horses, a horse does not sweat profusely all over unless they're really scared or in pain. Well, Reckless had never felt that much concussion pressure before. She'd been under fire on another deal called the Undock, and that one's on the computer with 3 February Operation Clambake. And I don't know who came up with the name of Clambake, but it was some type of bake. And you'll see there's 2 big pictures of smoke. And the smoke on the left is one of our flame tanks. I never saw so many Chinese in one place in all my time there, but we had 5 tanks. We lost 3 of them in 15 minutes. And the enemy was just swarming over them. And I had the assault deal with satchel charges and shape charges. We were smaller to get into the trenches. The Chinese trenches were, well, I could fit in them. But most of the guys, some of our guys got killed in the trenches because they got stuck and couldn't get turned around with an M1 rifle. And then they were bayoneted. But in this case, the flame tank, I don't know how those Chinese fired that can go 3 foot away with 3.5s, and they disabled the main gun turret. The driver couldn't rotate the barrel, and machine gunners on front, they could just fire straight into the hill. It's 20 below, that's in February, and slightly cool. And then the tank ignited, 140 gallons of napalm went up, and I was carrying my Billy Bob, my Thompson, that I'd take the stock off so I could get through the trenches. Is him 1920 A1 Thompson, and I couldn't quite reach him, but a buddy of mine, Al Kelly, could with his rifle, and it was hopeless because we had an assignment to get into the trenches, and so those were the two pictures that'll come up on the computer of Operation Clamback. And then as we got to the first phase, that Reckless then, the guns headed up, all three guns were already pre-positioned, and she was loaded with 6 to 8 rounds, depends on who was doing it. And it's a steep 45 slope and kind of a zigzag trail. And then in the first day and night, she made 51 trips and mounted to somebody, I think Lieutenant Pedersen calculated it was mounted to 35 miles. And the flare light that the planes were dropping, and Mrs. Heidi, and Mrs. Heidi Baker, and bless her, we're glad to see you, and this is in honor of that great other half of yours. So we're glad to see you here, and I'll continue on with this. But when the machine gun on the east side went up, and I knew that had to be Woody. He'd just gotten off the USS Repose, and the USS Repose was a Navy hospital ship. And there was also a young medic on Repose at that time, and he showed up later as one of the most loved doctors in St. Mary's history as Dice Thurston. Dice started his medical career on USS Repose.
Wow.
And he and I talked about that later. And of course, he's had a son, Rick, Dr. Rick, and then 2 notorious daughters, the Thurston girls, and you know them probably, but they just reflect the gracious mother that they had. And at that time, the dog company, it wasn't Delta Company, it was Dog Company of 2nd Battalion Pet Marines. Lieutenant Melvin led the first assault up the ridge with 42 Marines, and he came back with 9. And then my job started with trying to get him on. I lost 35 KSCs, the Chicken Bears, the first night. Some of them just ran off and dropped stretchers, and the Chinese paid no attention to the Geneva rules whatever. If they caught a stretcher of mine with one of our guys, they'd either band-aid him or dump him off the stretcher, take the South Korean and the stretcher, and I couldn't run them. I had a Thompson with 4 stick magazines, 30 rounds in each, and I had a satchel charge empty sack with 4 grenades and a whole bunch of 45 ammo for my Thompson. And I went through 4 magazines in that first night, and the Chinese paid no attention to whatever fire was coming. And the thing that the boy said really scared Reckless was when the artillery wires going out and the incoming, they would collide. And it just, it was worse than the 4th of July and all that hot shrapnel coming down. And we were supposed to burn all our gear after it was over. And whether I can, but that's from an airburst that knocked me flatter than a flitter. It went through my steel pot, and the helmet liner, it stuck. And of course, I already had a headache, so it didn't matter. But I shoved it in my pack, and then this is a flare from our 60 millimeter mortar that landed practically on my back. And I was raised on a ranch a long time ago, from 1934 on. Don't throw things away. And the other chutes were 8 foot. And I looked back in the flare light, and I see this silhouette of a horse. And I thought, good grief, how that can't be that mare. But sure enough, it was Reckless. And you can tell when the horse is overloaded and tired. She had her nose nearly to the ground, and they had 8 rounds on her, and she carried, I think, total, their gun crew said, 860 rounds, and it mounted to 5 tons of ammo that she supplied to her 3 gun teams, and their 75s on Grisham's gun. They were fired so fast in support of us that it crystallized their barrel. And when a machine gun barrel or a 75 barrel crystallizes from the heat, you can take an entrenching tool and whack it, it just shatters. That's the end of it. Well, they had to get a new barrel, new gun for that, but the thing that we used more efficiently than bayonets, we sharpened. I got files from the CBs, and we filed our entrenching tools. I could shave the hair on my arm with my entrenching tool. And whenever we encountered enemy down the trenches and that a rifle was too big, and my Thompson I had stuck in my pocket, that was awkward. And so that saved, well, didn't save his life, but Doc Billy Penn, if you find that on that computer, Redemption and Agony and Redemption, he was in a trench working on one of our guys, and a Chinese soldier jumped in the trench on him with the bayonet, and Doc kicked at him, and instead of getting his body, the bayonet stuck in his ankle joint, and then the soldier couldn't retract it, and Doc was laying on his right hip. His 45 is under his back. I talked to him years later, and the standard procedure, if your bayonet sticks, you fire around, and the bullet will blow your bayonet free. Well, Doc, praise the Lord for this. Doc lived through 3 dry fires on that bolt-action Chinese rifle, and he finally got his 45 out from him and killed the Chinese soldier, and then he had to get the bayonet dislodged from the rifle as well as his ankle, and he got that wounded Marine into what was left of the command post of sandbags, and they threw a satchel charge in on him, blew him out of there with both eyeballs on his cheek, and he was captured and taken off to a POW camp in that condition. And the Australian medic in that POW camp saved one eye. And I talked to Doc over the years, and at the dedication of Sergeant Reckless statue back in Virginia, why I phoned Doc in Louisiana. He was a doctor, and told him, and he says, "Well, you dumb Marines made a statue of a mule." And I said, "Doc, it's a horse. It's not a mule." But anyway, he was on a high level of pain medicine and said, "I can't make the dedication." And so with that, but the sharp entrenching tool saved his life. And if you want to see what the American flag really means to individuals, there was a kid in camp, prison camp with him, out of the 7th Marines, not out of our bunch, but he had a tattoo of the American flag on his shoulder. And the American prisoners, in spite of the guards, every day they pledged allegiance to that kid's shoulder, and they ran snap firing squads on Doc, and I think this kid's named Thompson. And, you know, just to try to scare you and so forth. Then finally, you know, one morning, Doc said they could tell that, okay, the guards are ticked off over something. We don't know what. But anyway, they felt just those two out, stood them out in the middle, and tell some of them speak better English than we could. And they said, now you try your pledge. And they didn't hesitate. And yeah, getting dry things. And of course, all the guys lined up and started their pledge. And one of the soldiers shot that kid right in the head, and he fell right at Doc's feet. And Doc recorded that in his deal. That's what the American flag means, and these that we have for the dead, we hear, you know, that. The Lord will have to wake them up,
right?
Because we don't. And then I was asked how I got to Vietnam, and I said, well, that wasn't hard. I'd been out about 14 years, and a district ranger with Linton and all of that crowd, and Linton still alive. Linton was with the 1st Air Cav in Vietnam and was wounded twice that I know of. And here he is. I figured if Linton lost a leg, he'd probably patch it up with sticks and rice straw and keep on going. But yeah, he's a very special friend of mine. But the Jane Fonda and all of that crew, for what they did against our guys in Vietnam, that louder. I don't know what her signal. Okay. Yeah. But at that time, in Jane Fonda at least went to into North Vietnam, into the prison camp, and Rear Admiral Grisham handed her a note. It was to his family that to tell him, his family, that I am okay. Well, what did she do with it? She turned it over to one of the North Vietnamese guards, and he hung for a week by his elbows and couldn't use his arms, just like McCain, after he came out. So I watched all that, and I thought, good grief. And then there were some, fleeing to Canada. And then others said, oh, this is not my war. Well, if you're in uniform, what guy in a uniform gets to choose his war? We were never asked, do you think this is? And we just got ammo and went for it. And so Gwen and I prayed a whole lot about what I felt I should do. And finally I said, no, I've got to try. And so I did the unforgivable. I wrote directly to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Wallace Green, and told him that I thought I could help these young guys in Vietnam, because all the old salts from the islands helped us younger ones in Korea. And I thought, will that be the end of it? But the Lord opened doors, and I got a phone call in about a week. It's from a colonel in the commandant's office, and he says, we checked your record, Marine, and one question, are you still in shape? And I said, sir, I'll put 40 pounds of rocks on my pack, and you put them on yours, and let's see who gets to the skyline first. And he said, good enough. And in another week, do what? Okay. And I received direct orders straight back to Vietnam, back to 5th Marines, but with Hotel 25. And I was with Hotel 25, and as the PFC, I said, no. They asked, are you interested in Officers Candidate School? No, sir, I'm not. I said, I need to be with the troops. And he says, good enough. And he sent that letter through the chain of command. So every time I got offered something, I could just refer them to that letter that was stated as his desire. But then finally, the guys, we lost an officer in weapons platoon, and I was moved up to platoon commander for that until I made my last hoorah. But we got towards Hawaii City, and there's a movie called Full Metal Jacket. Well, I haven't seen the movie and don't really want to, but that's of our company in Hawaii. And Doc, I have a hard time calling Ron Hodge Ron. He's Doc forever to me. He worked on some of my hotel guys that were chewed up at Hawaii, and I just thank him thanks for his medical service there at Tet as the big Chinese New Year. And so all these corpsmen are very special. And I'll close with two things on two Medal of Honor corpsmen that I was with in Korea. Billy Charette, his ribs and everything were out, and I tried to tie those up, and he refused to leave, and then he ended up, Eisenhower put a Medal of Honor around him. And then the other one, a good buddy, Doc Hammond, said, you bring him to me, because he was so shot up he couldn't get up. And I says, okay. And so I'd get back, and he says, I need medical supplies. He says, if you go back to the MLR and bring me a bunch of Demerol and bandages, etc. I said, okay, I'll get them. Of course, artillery and stuff, you can't imagine the veracity of that stuff. But in the Willie Peter, the Chinese used lots of white phosphorus. And I got back to the line and got his medical stuff, and came back to Doc, and Doc was dead, and so was the Chinese soldier that had Doc's scissors in his throat. And that was the last move that Doc made. But he got the Medal of Honor, and he didn't live, to get it. Those that have lived to get it is pretty special. We thank God that they did, because each one of them could have died, just instantly. And so with that, Reckless made it back to the States, to Pendleton, and lived till 1968, the 13th of May. She died at Camp Pendleton, California, Green Base, and she is buried there. And Robin Hutton wrote the great book, America's War Horse. She phoned this morning and said the big parade in Washington, D.C. will be today, and there's a horse that looks like Reckless, that my pack saddle that I put together for the statue will be on that. So she said, be watching the TV, and maybe you'll see that coming through. So with that, God bless every survivor, and particularly to the healing process. There's lots of wounds that don't bleed, and my bunch, we made a pledge. We were not taking Purple Hearts unless we were in the hospital, and so we all ended up with a lot more carriage, which Dr. McGuire, the optometrist, removed the sliver out of my corner of my eye that happened on Vegas, and he said, you have a cyst in your eye, have you ever had eye surgery? And I said, no. Well, he lanced it, and here's this little sliver out of what was a piece of a 120 rocket that came in and killed both Captain Waltz and Major Lee. Major Lee had fought on Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima, and he died on Vegas. So thanks for the invite, and remember, horses are very special animals. Thank you.
Thank you, Harold. Our own American hero, Bill Wadley, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.